The grandfather clock in my foyer, a gift from my late wife, chimed 6 times. The Westminster chimes were deep, resonant, and the only sound that had disturbed the silence of the house in hours. For a year, since my daughter Elena passed, this house had felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a well-appointed 4-story brownstone mausoleum in the heart of Greenwich Village. I was Judge Gideon Hayes. For 42 years I sat on the federal bench for the Southern District of New York. I was one of the Reagan appointments, a fact that always amused people who noted I was one of the few black men nominated that term. My career was not a quiet one. I was the judge who stared down the Hermanos Verdes cartel, sentencing their leadership to life at ADX Florence while U.S. Marshals sat in my living room. I was the judge who presided over the Intech v. GlobalData patent war, a $20 billion litigation so complex it required me to learn C++ just to understand the briefs. My life had been a fortress of law, procedure, and service. Now, it was just quiet. The doorbell rang. The sharp digital trill was an insult to the 19th century oak. I knew who it was without checking. The timing was too precise. I opened the heavy door. Richard Thorne stood on my stoop, bathed in the gaslight of the lamppost. He wasn't tea in a suit. He wore a $1,000 cashmere hoodie, $1,500 alligator skin sneakers, and a $50,000 watch. He was a walking billboard for things he hadn't earned. Richard had been married to my daughter. He was a creature of private equity, which was a polite term for a corporate raider. He bought healthy companies, loaded them with leveraged debt and stripped them for parts, leaving pension funds and employees bankrupt in his wake. He was a vulture who preferred his meals still breathing. "Gideon," he said. He didn't say Judge. He walked past me without an invitation, his eyes already scanning, appraising, calculating. He sniffed the air, a theatrical gesture of distaste. "Still smells like old books and... is that mothballs?" "Richard, you said your call was urgent." I closed the door, the sound a heavy, final thud. "It is," he said, pacing the library. His gaze raked over the leather-bound spines, the 19th century portraits, the original fireplace. He wasn't admiring, he was inventorying. "This place," he said, "it is a lot of house, Judge, a lot of asset. You rattling around in here all alone. It is a criminal waste of square footage." "It was my daughter's home," I said, my voice flat. "It was," he agreed, his tone patronizing. "And she was a wonderful, sentimental girl. But Elena is gone. And the market, Gideon, the market is white hot. It is a seller's paradise." He stopped pacing and turned to me. He arranged his face into a mask of friendly, predatory concern. The same mask, I imagined, he wore just before he fired 2,000 people. "I can prepare to make you an offer. Right now, cash." "An offer for what?" "The house, Gideon. This tomb. I'll give you $2 million, all cash. We can close in 10 days. You can take your books and move into a nice, clean, small condo, something you can actually afford." I had to suppress a smile. $2 million. For a 4-story, 4,000 square foot pre-war brownstone in the village. The New York Post had recently valued the property at 8. He wasn't making an offer. He was testing my senility. "The house is not for sale, Richard." "Don to be stupid," he snapped, the mask slipping. "Don to be sentimental. It is a bad investment. The upkeep, the property taxes, on your pension, it must be killing you." And there it was, the core of his contempt. To Richard, my life was a joke. I had been a public servant, a man who took a government paycheck, a man who sat on a bench, while real men like him were out building things. He couldn't distinguish between value and price. He saw my 40-year career of service not as a legacy, but as a financial failure. "My finances, Richard," I said, "are my own concern." "Are they?" He smiled, and it was a cold, thin thing. He walked over to my desk, Elena's desk, and sat on the edge, one leg swinging. "That is the thing, Judge. I don't think they are." He reached into his $4,000 leather satchel, a bag I knew Elena had despised, and pulled out a single, crisp document. He slid it across the polished mahogany. You're a man of the law, Gideon. Read the fine print. I put on my reading glasses. My hands did not tremble. I had spent a lifetime reading documents designed to intimidate. It wasn't a real estate offer. It was a notice of default. I don't understand, I said, though my mind was already racing, pulling up dusty files from decades past. Of course you done a T, he sneered. This isn't T jurisprudence. It is business. 10 years ago, when Elena was just starting out, you co-signed a mortgage for her first apartment. A little starter place in Brooklyn. You, bless your sentimental heart, probably forgot you even did it. I had forgotten. It was $85,000, a simple parental guarantee. The bank, Richard continued, was a small savings and loan, Tri-State Mutual, a real is a wonderful life kind of place. Well, Tri-State Mutual went under during the '08 crisis, and my company, Apex Equity Partners, we bought their distressed debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. We had been sitting on it for years. My blood began to turn cold. Your daughter Miss Mortgage count, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, was in that portfolio, and when she passed, that debt became part of her estate, an estate which I, as her grieving husband, now control. That debt was paid, I said, standing. The apartment was sold. The proceeds were rolled into the estate, yes, Richard agreed. But there was a clause, a contingency acceleration clause, a nasty little bit of fine print that said if the primary borrower died, the co-signer's guarantee could be called due in full, regardless of the estate's solvency. And I, as the new owner of the debt, am choosing to call it in. The estatem couldn't pay, so the debt, your co-signed debt, has defaulted. I looked at the paper. The amount was $85,000. This is nothing, I said. It is a nuisance. I'll write you a check. Richard laughed, a genuine barking ugly laugh. Pay it with what? Your pension? He mocked. Gideon, you don't get it. I am not here for the $85,000. I am here for the leverage. He leaned in, his voice dropping. That default, Judge, it is a lien. A lien that with a friendly judge I can attach to this house, to all your assets. I can bury you in legal fees. I can file for discovery and freeze your accounts. I can make your golden years a living, breathing hell. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out onto the street. He was posturing, playing the king. Your entire life was work, he said, his voice filled with a genuine acidic disdain. Your public service it's pathetic. You sat on a bench for 40 years while the world moved. You collected a government paycheck. You built nothing. You wrote opinions. He turned back, his eyes glittering. I build empires, and I am this close to the biggest deal of my life. A hostile takeover of Consolidated Steel, but I am illiquid. I need cash. I need leverage. Your house is that leverage. He picked up the default notice. So here is the real offer. Forget the $2 million. You are going to sign this house over to me, for free, as payment for this $85,000 debt. And in return, I won to ruin you. I won to tell the Wall Street Journal that the great Judge Gideon Hayes is a bankrupt old man who can pay his bills. You will sign it over and you will walk away. He was a vulture and he had just presented his terms. I stood silent for a long moment. I let the grandfather clock tick. Once, twice. The silence in the room became heavy, thick. You are, I said, a profound disappointment, Richard, not just as a man, but as a financial instrument. He frowned. The insult was not one he was used to. What? You sloppy, I said, gesturing to the paper. This leverage. It is weak. It is constructed on a fraudulent premise. The acceleration clause is likely unenforceable as you've applied it. The lien won to hold. I tear it apart in discovery before lunch. His face hardened. Try me, old man. I've got a dozen lawyers on retainer who say otherwise. They'll bury you. I have no doubt they'll try, I said, but I will not be trying what you, Richard, not in the way you think. You're a fool, he sputtered, his arrogance turning to rage as he realized his intimidation had failed. I'm giving you a way out. You are a pensioner. I am a king. I own banks. I own you. Richard, I said, walking to the door and opening it. Get out of my house. You'll be hearing from my lawyers, he shouted, snatching his satchel. You will be homeless in 6 months. Your pathetic career is worth nothing. You hear me? Nothing. He stormed out, slamming the door. The vibration rattled a portrait of Elena on the wall. The house was silent again, but the silence was different. It wasn't to the silence of grief. It was the silence of a battlefield after the first shell has landed. I walked back to the library, my hand brushing the spine of a first edition Blackstone. Richard S. words, a pathetic nothing, echoed in the room. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the confidence behind it. He believed it. He believed that money was the only metric, that service was a foolish game. I looked at the portrait of Elena. She was 20 in the painting, full of light, before she'd met him, before he deconvinced her that her passion for non-profit work was quaint, and that his world of hostile takeovers was real. He had leached the light out of her long before the cancer took her. This house, it was the last thing I had of hers. The last place that remembered her before him. And he was right about one thing. He could bleed me. An $85,000 debt was nothing. But the law, my chosen field, was a machine made of gears, and those gears were turned by money. Richard had an endless supply. I had a pension. A lease pendens, even a frivolous one, would take months, perhaps a year to clear. It would mean depositions. It would mean motions. It would mean legal bills easily climbing into the 6 figures. He would hire a pit bull firm, and they would attack me not on the merits of the case but on the process. They would bury me in paperwork, knowing I was one man, long retired. He was counting on me to be what he saw, a tired, old man, broken by grief, with limited resources. He was counting on me to settle, to give up the house just to make the pain stop, and for a moment I felt the pull of it, the exhaustion, the deep, bone-weary desire to just be done. To let the vulture have the carcass and retreat to my books. Richard saw me as a pensioner, a man whose net worth was a Zillow estimate and a government check. I sat at my desk, the default notice still warm from his hand. He had called me pathetic. He had called my life work nothing. It was time to show him precisely what that nothing had built. I picked up my phone. It was an old secure line, a relic from my days on the bench. It didn't just dial a number. It opened a door. "Ben," I said when the line clicked. "Judge?" Ben Collins' EOS voice was, as always, calm and ready. "He always left. He always left. And he always declared war, Ben. He always trying to steal my house over an $85,000 fraudulent debt. That's ambitious, even for him. We'll file a motion to dismiss." "No," I said. "This isn't a defensive action. This is a counter-offensive." He called my career pathetic. He said I built nothing. He has forgotten about Penstar. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Judge, are you sure?" "He is a predatory actor, Ben. He is exactly what the fund was built for. He has just made it personal. I want to know who owns him." "His financials are public, Judge. He is trying to take over Consolidated Steel. He is over-leveraged. I know. He told me he was illiquid. That means he is drowning in debt. Who holds the note?" "Who is the primary creditor?" "I'll get on it," Ben said. This is good, Judge. It is good to hear you and back in the saddle." "I am not in the saddle, Ben," I said, looking at Elena's portrait. "I am sharpening the sword." The next morning I did not go to the courthouse. I went to work. My work was no longer the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse. It was a discreet, unmarked office on the 40th floor of a glass and steel tower in Midtown. The only name on the door was a small sandblasted logo, the Meridian Justice Fund. Ben Collins was waiting for me. The large conference table, usually empty, was covered in printouts, SEC filings, news articles, and organizational charts. "He's a busy boy," one Ben said, handing me a coffee. "Apex Equity Partners, Richard I.S. Company. It has a house of cards, Judge, just as you thought." I spent the morning reading. Richard wasn't just a corporate raider. He was a gambler, betting the entire house on one last desperate play, the hostile takeover of Consolidated Steel. "It's all here in the 10K, Ben said, pointing to a line item. He has financed the entire play with short-term high-interest debt. He is using new debt to pay off old debt. He is not a raider. He is a kite, and the wind is about to die. Who holds the string, Ben? I asked again. That, Ben said, is the problem. He pointed to another chart. The debt isn't held by a bank. Not a real one. It is held by a string of shell companies, Delaware LLCs, a Cayman Islands holding company. It is designed to be untraceable. All of them seem to roll up to one entity, Oceanic Strategic Ventures. Oceanic, and I mused. Anonymous. Vague. I've never heard of them. Nobody has, Ben said. They re a ghost. We have the Fund S legal team digging, but this is what they do. They hide. Richard isn't smart enough to structure this, I said. He is arrogant, but he is not a financier. He is a blunt instrument. Someone else built this structure for him. Someone else is pulling his strings. Who? For 2 days we hit a wall. The Meridian Fund had deep pockets. We hired a forensic accounting firm. We hired a private investigator. They all came back with the same answer. Oceanic Strategic Ventures was a black box. We can to find the owner, Judge. Sarah Jennings, my lead counsel for the fund, said. She was a brilliant lawyer, poached from a top firm. The money trail goes from Delaware to the Caymans, then to a bank in Zurich. It is a dead end. We can to find out who Richard owes. If we can to find the creditor, I said, we can to buy the debt. If we can to buy the debt, we'd stuck in a defensive war over an $85,000 lien. Richard was winning. His strategy of bleeding me dry was working. I sat in the conference room staring at the chart. Oceanic. Oceanic. It sounded familiar. Ben, I said, pull the Penstar files. Judge, see 20 boxes. Just the defendants, list. The secondary and tertiary parties. The hedge funds that were shorting the stock. Ben disappeared. He returned an hour later with a single document. The list of co-conspirators and material witnesses. I ran my finger down the list, and there it was. Michael Wu, I read. A junior analyst at Penstar, he was their quant. He built the algorithm that hid the losses. He was unindicted. He testified for the prosecution. We gave him immunity. I remember him, Ben said. Sweaty, terrified, a numbers guy. Where is he now, Ben? It took the PI 3 hours. He runs a bank, Judge, Ben said, his voice strange. A very small, very private investment bank. Lighthouse Capital. And? Commercant Lighthouse Capital, as Ben said, is the sole domestic administrator for a foreign fund called Oceanic Strategic Ventures. The trap was set. Get me a meeting with Mr. Wu, I said. Today. He's notoriously private, Judge. He is, I said, but he and I are old friends. We have a shared history. Tell him, Judge Gideon Hayes wants to discuss the Penstar settlement. The private dining room at the Modern was all white walls and hushed tones. Michael Wu, CEO of Lighthouse Capital, looked like a man who had seen a ghost. He was no longer the sweaty, terrified junior analyst. He was a man in a $10,000 suit, but the terror was still there, under the surface. Judge Hayes, he said, his hands clasping and unclasping. An honor. A true honor. It has been a long time. It has, Michael, I said. You've done well for yourself. Lighthouse Capital. Oceanic Strategic Ventures. You've come a long way from that quant desk at Penstar. Wu went pale. I cannot confirm as it is privileged. Is it? I said, unfolding my napkin. I am not here as a judge, Michael. I am here as an investor. I am the sole trustee of the Meridian Justice Fund. The $350 million CI Prez Foundation, born from the Penstar case, the one your testimony helped create. He looked like he was going to be sick. I am not here to discuss your client, I continued. I am here to discuss your problem. Problem, he whispered. Your client is Mr. Richard Thorne. He is your biggest position. You, through Oceanic, hold a $120 million masternote on Apex Equity, due in 90 days. And you know, with actuarial certainty, that he is going to default. He has assured us. He has lying, I said. He is, as we speak, trying to steal a brownstone in Greenwich Village from a pensioner to make payroll. He's a bad bet, Michael. And when he defaults, you will be stuck with a portfolio of toxic, bankrupt assets. And your other investors, the ones who don't know you were an unindicted co-conspirator in the biggest fraud of the decade, they will start asking questions. My fund will start asking questions. I took a sip of water. I am here, I said, to solve your problem. Solve it. The Meridian Justice Fund will buy the note, the entire $120 million position. Wu choked on his water. He coughed into his napkin. Buy the note. That S not... Why? Why on earth? The Fund S mission, I said, is to fight predatory actors. Mr. Thorne is a predatory actor. We are uniquely motivated. Even if we wanted to sell, Wu stammered, my board would never. The risk, the haircut, selling a $120 million note that S about to default. I am not offering you 90 cents on the dollar, Mr. Wu, I said. I am offering you 105 cents. Wu dropped his fork. It clattered loudly on the plate. A 5% premium, $126 million in cash from our fund, wired to your account by end of business tomorrow. You get off the sinking ship and you get to tell your board you made a $6 million profit. You are not just safe, you're a hero. He stared at me. Why? He whispered, his voice trembling. Why are you doing this? Mr. Thorne, I said, called my 40-year career pathetic. I'm simply proving that public service has a very long-term and very specific return on investment. He picked up his phone. I need to call my board. I need to... Excuse me. You do that, I said. By the time the appetizers arrived, the deal was done. The Meridian Justice Fund I was now Richard Thorne S. Bank. I owned his debt. I owned him. The transfer was executed at 9 a.m. the next morning. It was silent, routed through a series of shell corporations the fund maintained for exactly this purpose. Richard Thorne had no idea. He went to bed that night thinking he was a king and that his only creditor was Lighthouse Capital. He woke up the next morning and he was my prey, but a desperate animal is a dangerous one. Richard, consumed with his Gideon problem, didn't wait. He was sloppy. He was furious. He needed to prove he was in charge. I was in my library reading a brief from the fund when the courier arrived. Judge Gideon Hayes? The young man asked, handing me a thick envelope. I signed for it. I opened it. It wasn't a foreclosure notice. It was a lease pendens. A lease pendens is a notice that a lawsuit has been filed, claiming an interest in a piece of real property. Richard, in his arrogance, had actually sued me. It was a frivolous, pathetic lawsuit. It claimed that his $85,000 default, which was fraudulent, and a vague interpretation of Elena's post-nup, which was legal toilet paper, gave him a $4 million stake in my home. It was a garbage suit. It would be thrown out. But a lease pendens is a poison pill. It is a public filing. It meant I could not sell, refinance, or even touch the equity in my home until the lawsuit was resolved. It was a cloud on the title, designed to bleed me dry in court, to force my hand. He thought he was playing chess. He thought he had just put my king in check. I looked at the document. The law firm on the letterhead was Sloane Carter. I almost laughed. Ben, I said into the phone. Judge? Sloane Carter. Richard hired Sloane Carter to file a lease pendens against me. There was a long silence on the other end. Sloane Carter. Judge, that S a problem. It was a problem. Sloane Carter was not just a firm, it was the firm. They were the most ruthless, most expensive, most unkillable corporate litigators in New York. They were the ones who had represented Penstar Securities. They were the ones I had beaten. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was a grudge. Richard hadn't just hired lawyers. He had hired my old enemies, and they would bleed me dry. They would file 100 motions. They would depose me for days. They would bury the Meridian Fund in subpoenas, trying to find a conflict of interest. They would use Richard S. petty grievance to try and undo my greatest victory. This was a complication, a real one. I sat in my library. The lease pendants lay on my desk. Richard thought he was in charge. He thought Sloane Carter worked for him. He had no idea he was just a tool, a battering ram aimed at me by a firm that had hated me for a decade. "Ben," I said, "call the lawyers." "To fight this?" Ben asked. They'll bury us." "I know," I said, a cold, hard anger settling into my bones. "Not to fight this, to end this." I drove to the Meridian Fund office. My legal team, 3 of the sharpest, most ruthless corporate lawyers in New York who earn a tea at Sloane Carter, were assembled in the conference room. "Richard Thorne has filed a frivolous suit against me," I said, dropping the lice pendants on the table. "He is using Sloane Carter," my lead counsel Sarah Jennings said. Her face was grim. She had cut her teeth at Sloane Carter. She knew the beast. "They were not after the house, Judge Gideon," she said. "They were after you. They were after the fund. They will use this as a pretext to subpoena our entire operation. They'll try to prove you, reusing a charitable foundation as a personal weapon. They could win." "Yes," I said. "They could, if we played their game." I looked at the 400-page loan agreement, the $120 million note, the one I now owned. "But we are not playing their game," I said. "We are playing mine. Sarah, you know this note. You helped me buy it. Find me the morality clause." Sarah's eyes went wide. She knew. She flipped to the back, to the covenants and restrictions section, the boilerplate that no one ever reads. "Page 288, section 4.1a, she said, her voice full of awe. "The reputational integrity clause. The debtor, I shall not engage in any litigation, frivolous or otherwise, or any public behavior that brings disrepute, scandal, or material risk upon the debtor or the associated assets." A frivolous public lawsuit against a retired federal judge filed by his own son-in-law, I said. "Does that bring disrepute?" It is a declaration of war," Sarah said. "No," I said. "It is a suicide note. He just violated his covenants. He is in default." We send a notice?" Ben asked. "A cease and desist?" "A notice," I said. "A notice gives them time to hide assets, time for Sloane Carter to file an injunction. No, we are not ceasing. We are accelerating. Judge, activate the note," I said. "All of it, $120 million. He is in default. I am calling the note, now." That is the death penalty," Sarah whispered. "It is," I said. "He has been trying to take my house. Taking his bank." Sloane Carter," Ben said. "They will fight the default. They will say it is, pretextual." "Let them," I said. "They are lawyers. They fight with motions. I am a trustee. I fight with proxies." I pointed to another section. "The note gives us proxy rights. Upon an incurable event of default, which this is, the creditor takes control of all voting shares. We are the board." What are you doing, Judge?" "I am not sending a notice," I said. "I am calling a meeting." The main boardroom of Apex Equity Partners was on the 55th floor. It was a monument to glass, chrome, and arrogance. The view was, admittedly, spectacular. Richard Thorne had been summoned to an emergency creditors meeting. He thought he was meeting with Lighthouse Capital. He thought he was going to bluff, bully, and beg for another 90-day extension. He walked into the boardroom at 10 a.m. sharp. He was flanked by 2 lawyers from Sloane Carter, a man named Harrison and a junior associate. He looked smug. He was ready for a fight. He was not prepared. His entire executive team, his CFO, his COO, his general counsel, were already seated at the table, looking pale and terrified. And at the head of the table, in the chairman's seat, sat Judge Gideon Hayes. Ben Collins stood behind me. My legal team from the Meridian Fund stood like sentinels by the door. Richard stopped. He physically recoiled as if he walked into a wall. The lawyers from Sloane Carter froze, their expensive briefcases still in hand. They recognized me, and they, unlike Richard, knew what I was capable of. "Gideon," Richard stammered. What the hell are you doing here? This is a private creditors meeting. Security, get him out." They don't work for you, Richard, I said. My voice was quiet, but the acoustics in the room were perfect. The senior partner from Sloane Carter, Harrison, put his hand on Richard's arm. Richard, shut up. What? Ben, I said. Ben Collins, with the quiet dignity of a man who had served the law for 40 years, walked over to Richard and handed him a single one-page document. This, I said, is a notice of acceleration. The $120 million master note, which you used to build this empire, is now due, in full, as of 90 seconds ago. Richard looked at the paper. He didn't understand. Lighthouse wouldn't... Lighthouse Capital sold the note, and I said. They sold it to a more motivated party. They sold it to the Meridian Justice Fund. The what? Richard looked at his CFO. What is that? The CFO, a man who clearly knew he was about to lose his job, just stared at the table. Harrison, the Sloane Carter lawyer, whispered, It's his fund, you idiot. The Penn Star settlement. So Richard is face down. It was a masterpiece, a symphony of arrogance, confusion, and dawning abyssal horror. You can he whispered. You pensioner. Pathetic. And you, I said, are in default. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. You filed a frivolous lawsuit against me yesterday, I said, looking out at the city. A lis pendens. It was sloppy. It was stupid. And it was a direct violation of Section 4.A of your loan agreement. You brought disrepute out upon your assets. That is a technicality, he shrieked. I spent my life in technicalities where, Richard, I said, that is what the law is. I turned back to him. The Meridian Fund now controls the proxies. We are the board, and as our first act, we are voting. All in favor of removing Richard Thorne as CEO and chairman of Apex Equity, effective immediately. My team, Ben and I, all raised our hands. All opposed? Richard just stood there, his mouth open. Harrison was already packing his briefcase. He knew a lost cause. The motion carries, and I said, You're refired, Richard. You think you can just steal my company? He roared. Steal? I said. No, this isn't a theft. This is a liquidation. You called me pathetic. You called my life's work nothing. But that nothing just bought your everything. I gestured to my legal team. The fund is now taking control of all Apex assets. Your predatory company is going to be dismantled. Its assets will be sold, and the proceeds will be used to pay back the victims of your other hostile takeovers. My money, he whispered. My accounts. My cars. They're frozen, my lawyer Sarah said, finally speaking. All personal assets tied to the corporate debt are frozen. Your company-issued credit cards were deactivated 1 hour ago. The penthouse, the jet, they were corporate assets, Richard. They are ours now. He sank into a chair. A king 1 minute, a pensioner the next. The house, he mumbled, the $85,000, the lis pendens. Has been forgiven, I said. A rounding error. Thus you were free of that nuisance, Richard. You were free of everything. Harrison and his junior associate were at the door. Judge, Harrison said with a nod, not of respect, of acknowledgement. A shark acknowledging a larger shark. Mr. Harrison, I said, a pleasure as always. They left. Richard sat in the ruins of his life, a man who had flown too close to the sun, not realizing the sun was, in fact, a retired federal judge. One more thing, I said. He looked up, his eyes dead. In our due diligence, I said, our review of the Apex books, we found irregularities, things that Lighthouse Capital in their haste must have missed, wire fraud, tax evasion, a lot of it. The Meridian Fund, I said, has a legal obligation to report such crimes. As if on cue, the boardroom doors opened. 2 FBI agents and my old friend, U.S. Attorney David Barone, walked in. Richard Thorne, David said, you are under arrest. Richard didn't even react, he just sat there. I walked past him as they pulled him to his feet. I didn't look back. I went home. The grandfather clock was striking noon. The house was no longer a tomb, it was a home. my home. Elena S. home. Richard had made a critical, fatal error. He had looked at me, a black man who had served his country for 40 years, and seen only pathetic. He forgot that in a battle between service and stock, service has a much longer memory, and in the end, it always builds the thing that matters, a legacy. And a legacy is a hell of a weapon.